The security footage timestamp read 11:23 p.m. when the screaming began. The Shangri-La Hotel's 23rd floor, where rooms cost $800 per night and discretion was considered a complimentary amenity, wasn't accustomed to the kind of primal shrieking that now echoed through its marble corridors. The sound wasn't fear or pleasure, but something far more visceral. Rage, heartbreak, and the specific howl of someone watching their entire life detonate in real time through grainy surveillance video being played on a smartphone held by steady, manicured hands. Isabella Garcia, 32 years old and still wearing her Singapore General Hospital nursing scrubs under a hastily thrown-on jacket, stood in the hotel hallway staring at her own image on the phone screen. There she was, 2 weeks ago, checking into this same hotel with Captain Marcus Ashford, laughing as he pulled her close for a kiss that the camera captured in perfect, damning clarity. There they were again, last month, emerging from the elevator with his arm around her waist, her hand in his back pocket, both of them radiating the intoxicated glow of people who believed they were getting away with something. And there, most devastatingly, was footage from 3 days ago. Isabella and Marcus entering room 2347 at 2:00 p.m., not emerging until 6:30 p.m., their disheveled appearances leaving zero doubt about what 4.5 hours in a luxury hotel room had entailed. The phone was held by Victoria Ashford, Marcus's wife of 15 years, former Singapore Airlines flight attendant turned trophy wife, and the woman whose family money had actually purchased the pilot skills that Marcus loved to claim he'd earned through merit alone. Victoria had been planning this confrontation for 6 weeks, collecting evidence like ammunition, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy both her husband and his mistress simultaneously. That moment was now, in this hallway, with hotel security hovering uncertainly nearby, while Victoria's voice carried the calm, surgical precision of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times. "These videos go live on Facebook in exactly 1 hour, Victoria announced, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. "Every medical board in Singapore will see them, your hospital administrators, your nursing supervisors who trusted you with their most vulnerable patients, your family in Manila who think you're sending money home from respectable work. Everyone will know exactly what kind of nurse you really are." Isabella's response was a sound no human vocal cords should produce. Part scream, part sob, pure animal terror at watching your professional reputation, visa status, and family's respect disintegrate in 60 minutes. She lunged for the phone, desperate to delete the evidence, but Victoria stepped back smoothly, her movement practiced and precise. The confrontation escalated from verbal to physical in seconds. 2 women grappling in an expensive hallway while hotel security tried to intervene, and Marcus stood frozen in the doorway of room 2347, watching his 2 worlds collide with catastrophic force. What happened over the next 72 hours would shock Singapore's expatriate community, horrify the Filipino nursing population, and generate headlines that asked uncomfortable questions about fidelity, revenge, and how far someone would go to destroy the woman who'd stolen their husband. By the time the blood was cleaned from the marble floors, and the bodies were removed from the penthouse that overlooked Marina Bay, 3 lives would be over, and the security footage that started it all would become evidence in a murder-suicide case that exposed the deadly intersection of betrayal, public humiliation, and rage with nowhere left to go. This is the story of how an affair became an execution, and how the cruelest punishment isn't always physical. Sometimes it's forcing someone to watch their entire life destroyed before killing them. Isabella Marie Garcia understood healing from personal experience, not the sterile, textbook version taught in nursing school, but the messy, desperate kind born from watching people you love suffer from problems you can't afford to fix. She was born on July 15, 1990, in Tondo, Manila, in a neighborhood where poverty wasn't just economic condition, but inherited destiny that crushed generations beneath its weight like an avalanche in slow motion. Her father, Eduardo, worked at Manila's port doing manual labor that destroyed his body for wages that barely sustained life. Her mother, Rosario, was a lavenderer, a washerwoman who spent 12-hour days scrubbing other people's clothes in the Pasig River, her hands perpetually raw, her back bent from carrying heavy loads, her face aged beyond its years from tropical sun and relentless work. They lived in a 10-by-10-foot room in a compound housing 14 families, their entire existence contained in a space smaller than some people's closets, their privacy reduced to thin curtains and whispered conversations that everyone could hear anyway. Isabella was the second of 5 children born into circumstances that made survival feel like daily miracle. Her older brother, Miguel, had died at 7 from dengue fever because the family couldn't afford the hospital care that might have saved him. That loss carved something permanent into Isabella's psyche, a determination that medical care shouldn't be a luxury, that healing was a right, not a privilege, and that she would somehow, impossibly, become someone who provided care rather than begged for it. School was a battleground where Isabella fought against every disadvantage her birth had assigned her. She studied by candlelight when electricity was cut for non-payment, used borrowed textbooks whose pages were falling out, and attended classes in a uniform she'd patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible. But she was brilliant in the way that desperation sometimes produces, not naturally gifted, but relentlessly disciplined, understanding that intelligence was her only asset worth more than her labor. At 16, after watching her grandmother die from untreated diabetes because insulin was too expensive and hospitals turned away the poor, Isabella made a decision that would shape everything that followed. She would become a nurse, emigrate to a country that paid healthcare workers properly, and send enough money home to ensure that no one in her family ever again died from preventable causes, while rich people's pets received better medical care than poor people's children. She attended Far Eastern University on a scholarship that covered tuition but nothing else, working nights at a 24-hour convenience store to pay for books, transportation, and the minimal food she needed to avoid malnutrition-induced illness. She slept 4 hours nightly, studied obsessively, and graduated in 2012 with honors and the kind of exhaustion that felt like it had aged her a decade beyond her 22 years. The nursing board exam, which she passed on her first attempt, was simultaneously her greatest achievement and the starting gun for a new race toward overseas employment that represented her family's only hope for escaping generational poverty. The processing for Singapore nursing positions took 18 months and cost 250,000 pesos, borrowed from relatives and loan sharks charging interest rates that would take 5 years to repay. Medical exams, English proficiency tests, skills certifications, agency fees, and the endless bureaucratic expenses that separated dreamers from achievers. Isabella signed documents she barely understood, took exams that felt designed to humble rather than assess, and endured the humiliating cattle call recruitment process where hundreds of Filipino nurses competed for limited positions that represented everything they'd ever wanted. She arrived in Singapore on March 3, 2014 at 23 years old, carrying 2 suitcases and a debt that would haunt her for years. The contrast between Manila and Singapore was so stark it felt like traveling to a different planet. The obsessive cleanliness, the orderly queues, the infrastructure that actually functioned, the wealth displayed so casually it seemed almost obscene. Singapore General Hospital, where she'd been placed, was a facility that spent more on single surgeries than Tondo's public hospital spent annually. The equipment was state-of-the-art, the medication stockrooms fully supplied, and the patient-to-nurse ratios manageable rather than criminally dangerous. Her starting salary was $800 monthly, approximately 100,000 pesos, more than both her parents earned combined. After deducting $600 for her shared room in a flat with 3 other Filipino nurses, she sent $500 home monthly and lived on $700 that had to cover food, transportation, phone, and the debt repayment that consumed 40% of what remained. By Singaporean standards, she was poor. By her family's standards, she was their savior. The money she sent home had moved them from Tondo to a modest but decent house in Bulacan, had put her younger siblings through school, and had finally given her parents access to medical care that treated them like humans rather than inconveniences. The work itself was demanding in ways nursing school hadn't fully prepared her for. 12-hour shifts that often extended to 14 rotating schedules that destroyed circadian rhythms, the physical toll of lifting patients, and standing on unforgiving hospital floors, and the emotional exhaustion of caring for people at their most vulnerable while maintaining the professional distance that prevented complete burnout. But Isabella was good at it, naturally empathetic, clinically competent, and possessing the kind of unflappable calm that made her valuable during medical emergencies when other nurses panicked. By 2016, she'd been promoted to senior staff nurse with a salary increase to $3,400 monthly. By 2018, she was working in the cardiac care unit, the hospital's most prestigious and demanding department, where patient acuity was highest and mistakes could be instantly fatal. She was respected by physicians, valued by administrators, and beloved by patients who remembered her even after being transferred to other wards. She was succeeding at everything she'd set out to achieve. But she was also profoundly lonely. Her social life existed primarily within Singapore's Filipino nursing community, a tight-knit but insular world of women working similar hours for similar reasons. Their conversations dominated by remittance strategies, visa renewals, and the perpetual homesickness that overseas workers carried like background radiation. She dated occasionally, a few Filipino men working in Singapore, one brief relationship with a Singaporean Chinese guy who'd ultimately decided his family wouldn't accept a Filipino girlfriend. But nothing lasted beyond a few months. The combination of exhausting work schedules, cultural barriers, and her own awareness that romantic relationships were expensive complications she couldn't afford kept her perpetually single. By early 2022, at 31 and approaching 8 years in Singapore, Isabella had achieved financial security for her family, but had sacrificed any semblance of personal life. She missed her younger sister's wedding because her visa time-off limitations made traveling to Manila impossible. She'd video-called her parents' anniversary celebration from a hospital break room while eating vending machine food. She'd watched friends from nursing school get married and have children while she sent money for their baby showers and christenings. She was successful by every metric she'd set for herself and miserable in ways she'd never anticipated. The loneliness was compounded by the peculiar invisibility of foreign healthcare workers in Singapore. She provided intimate care to wealthy patients, bathed them, dressed their wounds, held their hands during frightening procedures, witnessed their most vulnerable moments, but most couldn't remember her name the next day. She was functionally interchangeable with the other Asian nurses, her individuality erased by the uniform and the casual racism that made expat helpers simultaneously essential and invisible. She existed in a strange liminal space, intimate with people's bodies, but unknown as a person, valued for her labor but not respected as fully human. In March 2022, desperately needing to feel like something more than a remittance-producing machine, Isabella made a decision that felt both rebellious and pathetically small. She booked herself a staycation at a decent hotel. Not luxury like the places where her patients stayed, but a nice 4-star property in Clarke Quay where she could have 48 hours of being served rather than serving, of sleeping in high thread count sheets, of feeling like her life had value beyond its utility to others. The hotel bar on her first evening, there was where she met Captain Marcus Ashford, and where everything that followed began its inevitable progression toward disaster. Captain Marcus Ashford represented a very specific type of Singaporean success story, the kind built on family money dressed up as personal merit, where every advantage was reframed as achievement and every opportunity was described as earned rather than inherited. He was born in 1978 to British expatriates who'd settled in Singapore during the 1970s economic boom. His father, a senior executive at a multinational bank. His mother, a socialite whose charity work was really just networking disguised as compassion. Marcus grew up in District 10, attending United World College on his parents' money, spending summers in England with his aristocratic relatives, and absorbing the particular arrogance that comes from never having to worry about money while being told constantly that you're special rather than simply privileged. He was handsome in that bland, symmetrical way that magazines used to sell expensive watches. Tall, fit, with the kind of golden boy aesthetic that opened doors before he even knocked. His path to becoming a commercial pilot was paved with family connections and financial resources most people couldn't access. Flight school at $40,000, additional ratings and certifications at $15,000 more, the kind of leisurely training schedule that people who actually work can't afford. By 25, he was flying for Singapore Airlines, accumulating hours in beautiful destinations while living in an Orchard Road apartment his parents had purchased as an investment property that he occupied rent-free. He met Victoria Lim in 2005 when they were both working for Singapore Airlines. He as a first officer, she as a senior flight attendant. Victoria came from old Singaporean money. Her grandfather had made a fortune in property development during Singapore's post-independence boom. Her father had multiplied it through careful investments, and Victoria herself had a trust fund that made her flight attendant's salary functionally irrelevant. She worked because it was glamorous and gave her something to do, not because she needed the money. Their courtship was a merger as much as romance. His British expatriate credentials combined with her local Chinese wealth, creating a power couple that moved comfortably through Singapore's elite social circles. They married in 2007 in a wedding at Capella, Singapore that cost $300,000 and was featured in luxury lifestyle magazines. Victoria quit working shortly after, transitioning to full-time wifing in their penthouse overlooking Marina Bay, a property valued at $8 million that her family had purchased for them as a wedding gift. By 2022, Marcus was a senior captain earning $15,000 monthly plus benefits, though that figure was almost irrelevant given Victoria's family wealth that actually sustained their lifestyle. The penthouse, the cars, a Porsche for him, a Mercedes for her, the country club memberships, the frequent vacations to Maldives and Europe, all were funded primarily through Victoria's trust fund and family connections. Marcus's pilot salary was pocket money dressed up as career success. They had 2 children, Olivia, 13, and Sebastian, 11, attending Singapore American School at annual costs exceeding $40,000 per child. The family looked perfect in their Christmas photos. Successful father, beautiful mother, accomplished children, the kind of life that inspired envy from those who didn't look closely enough to notice the cracks. Because the marriage had been dying slowly for years, atrophying from partnership into performance art, Marcus and Victoria shared a home, children, social obligations, and financial entanglements, but genuine affection had evaporated sometime around 2015, replaced by polite coexistence punctuated by arguments about his drinking, her spending, and their mutual resentment about roads not taken. They slept in separate bedrooms, took separate vacations justified by his flight schedules and her family obligations, and maintained their marriage primarily because divorce would be expensive, socially complicated, and disruptive to children who were accustomed to a certain lifestyle. Marcus's previous affairs had been brief and strategic: flight attendants on layovers, occasional hotel bar pickups, women who understood the terms and expected nothing beyond the immediate encounter. He'd been careful, discreet, and emotionally uninvested. But by 2022, at 44, and feeling the weight of a life that looked successful from outside while feeling hollow from within, Marcus found himself craving something beyond anonymous encounters. He wanted validation, attention, the feeling of being desired rather than tolerated. He noticed Isabella at the hotel bar on a Friday evening in March 2022, sitting alone with a glass of wine and a book, still wearing subtle traces of her hospital shift in her exhausted posture and the way she rubbed her lower back unconsciously. She was beautiful in a way that felt accessible rather than intimidating, naturally pretty rather than artificially maintained, warm rather than cold, alone without projecting the desperate availability of women obviously hunting for companions. His approach was calculated in its apparent casualness. "Good book. You look like you could use another glass of wine and someone to tell you it's okay to take a break." It was a line refined through practice, delivered with a smile that had opened many doors before, backed by the confidence of someone who'd rarely been rejected, and who possessed the resources to make rejection hurt less if it happened. Isabella, lonely and tired and desperately wanting to feel like something more than a nursing machine, responded with cautious interest. They talked for 2 hours, about her work in vague terms, about his flying in glamorized terms, about Singapore as a place to live versus a place to survive. He was charming, attentive, interested in ways that made her feel seen for the first time in months. He bought expensive drinks without showing off about it, laughed at her observations about hospital culture, and made her feel clever rather than just useful. He didn't mention his wife until Isabella asked directly if he was married. His response was the classic affair playbook, delivered with practiced sincerity. "Legally, yes. Practically, no. We're together for the children and financial reasons, but we've been living separate lives for years. She has her interests, I have mine, and we've reached an understanding that works for us." It was a lie, of course, or at minimum a strategic reshaping of truth that obscured how much Victoria would care if she knew about his extracurricular activities. But Isabella, inexperienced in the relationship dynamics of wealthy, unhappy marriages, wanted to believe him. The alternative was acknowledging that this attractive, successful man paying attention to her was simply using her, and that acknowledgement would mean returning to her lonely existence with nothing changed. They slept together that night, in Isabella's staycation hotel room that Marcus privately found charmingly modest compared to the 5-star properties where he usually conducted affairs. The sex was good, not revolutionary, but satisfying in the way that new relationships often are, charged by novelty and genuine attraction rather than just physical gratification. Afterward, lying in the dark with Isabella's head on his chest, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: content. Not happy, not in love, but content in a way that his perfectly appointed penthouse with his coldly furious wife had stopped providing long ago. The affair that developed over the following months settled into predictable patterns. They met 2 to 3 times weekly, usually afternoons when Marcus's flight schedule provided cover and Isabella could coordinate her shifts to create windows. They always booked the same hotel, the Shangri-La in Orchard, room 2347 whenever possible, creating a bubble where the complications of their real lives couldn't intrude. Marcus paid for everything: the hotels at $800 per night, dinners at restaurants Isabella would never afford on her salary, gifts that ranged from thoughtful to expensive. He gave her $2,000 monthly, framed as helping with her family obligations, though both understood it was compensation that allowed them to pretend their relationship was more than transactional. Isabella accepted the money because she needed it, because it allowed her to send more home and reduce her debt faster, and because accepting made her feel less like a mistress and more like someone being cared for. She fell in love, or what she convinced herself was love, the intoxicating mix of attention, affection, financial security, and the validation of being chosen by someone successful and sophisticated. Marcus represented everything her life in Singapore hadn't provided: romance, excitement, the feeling of being valued for more than her utility. She documented nothing on social media, told none of her friends, maintained complete discretion because she understood that foreign nurses who slept with married men faced consequences that Singapore Airlines captains somehow never did. Marcus felt something too, though it was more complex than love. Affection certainly, genuine enjoyment of her company, and the ego gratification of being adored by someone who asked nothing of him beyond his presence and limited resources. But he was also aware, in the way that people conducting affairs always are somewhere beneath their rationalizations, that this couldn't last. Eventually, Victoria would discover it, or Isabella would want more than he could provide, or the logistical complications would become unmanageable. He was enjoying it while it lasted, but he wasn't planning a future beyond the next hotel reservation. By September 2022, 6 months into their affair, Isabella was deeply invested emotionally and beginning to imagine futures that Marcus had never promised but hadn't explicitly discouraged. She spoke tentatively about what might happen if he actually left Victoria, about whether she could meet his children eventually, about long-term plans that made Marcus uncomfortable, but which he deflected rather than shutting down. He cared about her enough not to want to hurt her immediately, even while understanding that hurt was inevitable. What neither of them realized was that Victoria had known about the affair since July 2022, and that she was methodically collecting evidence while deciding exactly how to destroy both of them in ways that would hurt most. Victoria Lim Ashford had not been a passive, trusting wife for many years. Marcus's previous affairs had taught her to recognize the signs: the improved grooming, the gym membership suddenly taken seriously, the phone angled away during texts, and most obviously, the emotional absence that intensified when he was physically present. By July 2022, she knew he was cheating. What remained was identifying the woman and deciding the appropriate response. Her first instinct was to hire a private investigator, which she did through a discreet firm that catered to Singapore's wealthy wives who needed documentation for leverage or divorce. The investigator's report, delivered in August, provided the basics. Marcus was involved with Isabella Garcia, a 32-year-old Filipino nurse at SGH, meeting her regularly at Shangri-La Hotel in room 2347 and apparently providing her with monthly financial support. The report included surveillance photos, Isabella and Marcus entering the hotel, emerging hours later with the unmistakable glow of satisfied affair participants, plus credit card receipts documenting the pattern. Victoria's rage, when it fully crystallized, was complex and multidirectional. She was furious at Marcus for the obvious reasons: betrayal, disrespect, the public humiliation if this became known to their social circle. But she was equally enraged by his choice of affair partner: a nurse, a Filipino foreign worker, someone so far beneath their social status that the affair felt like an insult beyond simple infidelity. If Marcus was going to destroy their marriage, couldn't he at least have chosen someone who wasn't functionally the hired help? The classism and racism in Victoria's reaction was evident but unremarkable. She'd grown up in social circles where Filipino domestic workers were ubiquitous and uniformly viewed as service labor rather than full humans, where the idea of one of them sleeping with a proper man was simultaneously absurd and threatening. That Marcus had chosen someone of Isabella's background felt like he was deliberately degrading Victoria by association, choosing poverty and foreignness over everything Victoria represented. But Victoria was strategic in her fury. Immediate confrontation would force Marcus to choose and might result in a divorce that, while financially survivable given her family wealth, would be socially awkward and disruptive to her children's lives. What she wanted was more comprehensive. She wanted Marcus to understand the consequences of his choices, Isabella to experience devastation that matched what Victoria was feeling, and both of them to recognize that Victoria held all the power they'd been foolish enough to underestimate. She hired a second investigator, this one with specific instructions: obtain hotel security footage showing Marcus and Isabella's comings and goings. This required more sophistication than simple surveillance. It meant bribing hotel security staff, downloading footage from internal systems, and compiling a comprehensive video record of the affair's logistics. It took 6 weeks and cost $15,000, money Victoria considered well spent for the ammunition she was accumulating. The footage was devastating in its mundane detail. Marcus and Isabella arriving at the hotel, checking in, taking the elevator, emerging hours later. The timestamps, the repeated pattern, the body language that left zero doubt about the nature of their encounters. It wasn't dramatic or pornographic. The cameras captured only hallways and lobbies, but it was comprehensive evidence that would destroy professional reputations and personal relationships if released publicly. Victoria's plan crystallized in early October 2022. She would confront Isabella first, privately, in a way that would terrify and destabilize her. Then she would force both of them into a confrontation where they'd have to acknowledge what they'd done, while Victoria held complete control over the narrative and consequences. The hotel, where they'd conducted their affair with such casual disregard for discovery, seemed the perfect location for their reckoning. On October 20th, 2022, Victoria hacked into Marcus's email using a password she'd obtained months earlier, saw his hotel reservation for that evening with guest listed, and knew this was her moment. She arrived at the Shangri-La at 11:00 p.m., taking position in the hallway outside room 2347, and waited. The confrontation that followed, Isabella emerging from the room to find Victoria holding a phone showing surveillance footage, the screaming, the grappling, hotel security intervening, was exactly the public humiliation Victoria had been planning for months. "These videos go live in 1 hour," Victoria had announced, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Your hospital will see them, your nursing board, your family. Everyone will know exactly what kind of nurse you are." The threat was perfectly calibrated to destroy Isabella specifically. For a foreign worker whose visa status depended on maintaining good standing with employers, whose professional reputation was the only protection against deportation, and whose family's financial survival depended on her continued employment, public exposure of an affair with a married man would be catastrophic. The nursing board could revoke her license. The hospital could terminate her employment. Immigration could cancel her visa. And her family, devoutly Catholic and already sacrificing to support the siblings she was educating, would be devastated by the shame. Isabella's terror was exactly what Victoria had wanted to see. The moment when the other woman realized that the glamorous affair was actually a trap that would destroy everything she'd worked for. The physical struggle that followed, Isabella lunging desperately for Victoria's phone while hotel security tried to separate them, was ugly and raw and satisfying in a way that Victoria hadn't anticipated. This was power, making someone who'd stolen from you watch helplessly as you demolished their entire existence. But Victoria's plan had one variable she hadn't fully considered: Marcus himself, who emerged from the hotel room to find his wife confronting his mistress, and who realized in that moment that his comfortable life was about to implode. His response, trying to de-escalate, begging Victoria for privacy, promising to end it, was pathetic and enraged Victoria further. He was still trying to manage both of them, still trying to avoid consequences, still believing he could negotiate his way out. "You don't get to negotiate," Victoria told him, her voice acid. "You get to watch what happens when you fuck the help and think there won't be consequences. Both of you, you're coming with me. Now. Or I post everything immediately and call her hospital administration tonight." The coercion was blatant, possibly illegal, and absolutely effective. Marcus and Isabella, realizing they had no power in this situation, followed Victoria to the elevator, then to the parking garage, then to Victoria's Mercedes, where she drove them to the Marina Bay penthouse that Marcus had been living in for 15 years, but which had always been Victoria's property through her family's wealth. What happened over the next 12 hours would transform Victoria's plan for humiliation into something far darker, and would end with blood on marble floors, and 3 lives destroyed in ways that surveillance footage could document but never explain. The drive to the Marina Bay penthouse was conducted in toxic silence, Victoria driving with controlled precision, Marcus in the passenger seat staring at his hands, and Isabella in the back seat experiencing the kind of terror that comes from realizing you've walked into a trap with no visible exit. The city lights blurred past the windows, Singapore's famous safety and order providing no comfort to someone whose entire existence in the city-state was about to be destroyed by a woman with resources and rage. They arrived at the penthouse at 12:14 a.m. Victoria parked in the private garage, used her access card to bypass the building's security systems, and led them to the private elevator that serviced only the top 3 floors where Singapore's ultra-wealthy lived in climate-controlled luxury. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, 8,000 square feet of imported marble, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Marina Bay, furniture that cost more than Isabella earned annually, and everywhere the evidence of wealth so extreme it seemed almost obscene. "Sit," Victoria commanded, gesturing to the living room's white leather sectional that probably cost $50,000. Marcus and Isabella sat, not touching, both aware that proximity would enrage Victoria further. She remained standing, phone in hand, her finger hovering over the Facebook upload button that would release the surveillance footage to the internet and destroy both their lives within minutes. "I've been very patient," Victoria began, her voice carrying the controlled fury of someone who'd been rehearsing this speech for months. 6 months I've known about you too. 6 months I've watched my husband sneak off to fuck someone who wipes bedpans for a living while I stayed home with our children and maintained our social obligations. 6 months I've smiled at charity galas while knowing he was spending our money on hotel rooms and gifts for his little nurse." "Victoria, please," Marcus started, but she cut him off with a gesture. "You don't speak. You lost that privilege when you decided your dick was more important than our marriage. I want to hear from her." Victoria's attention shifted to Isabella, who was shaking visibly now. "Tell me, Isabella, do you love him? Did you think this was going somewhere, that he'd leave me and his children for a foreign worker with debt and a family to support?" Isabella's mouth opened, but no sound emerged initially. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry, I never meant to." "You never meant to what? Fuck a married man? Take money from him? Destroy a family? Which part was accidental?" Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You saw a wealthy man and you opened your legs because you needed the money and the attention and the fantasy that you were something more than what you actually are." The cruelty in Victoria's voice was deliberate and devastating, designed to strip away any dignity Isabella had left. But beneath the rage was pain, genuine hurt that her husband had chosen someone else, that 15 years of marriage and 2 children hadn't been enough, that she'd been replaced by someone whose only advantage was being newer and grateful. "Here's what's going to happen," Victoria continued, pulling up the videos on her phone. "I'm going to show you both exactly what I have. You're going to watch yourselves on camera, see how obvious and sloppy you've been, and then you're going to decide how badly you want me not to post this." She cast the videos to the penthouse's enormous television, and for the next 15 minutes forced them to watch surveillance footage of their affair. The arrivals, the departures, the timestamps that showed the pattern, the body language that left zero doubt. It was humiliating in the specific way that seeing yourself from outside perspective can be, watching behavior that felt meaningful in the moment reduced to sordid transaction captured by security cameras. When the videos ended, Victoria turned to Isabella with an expression that mixed contempt and something almost like pity. "You really thought you mattered to him? You were a distraction, an ego boost, a midlife crisis in a nurse's uniform, and now you're going to pay for being stupid enough to believe you were anything more." What happened next occurred too quickly for anyone to prevent. Isabella, broken by humiliation and terror about her career being destroyed, lunged for Victoria's phone with desperate ferocity born from having nothing left to lose. They collided with force that sent them both stumbling, Isabella's hands grasping for the phone while Victoria tried to push her away. Marcus jumped up to separate them, his hands reaching for Isabella's shoulders. The knife came from Victoria's purse, a small blade she'd been carrying for weeks, telling herself it was just for protection, not admitting that some part of her had been fantasizing about using it on the woman who'd stolen her husband. When Isabella's momentum brought them both crashing into the kitchen counter, Victoria's hand closed around the blade instinctively. What followed was less conscious decision than reflex born from months of accumulated rage. The first stab caught Isabella in the abdomen, Victoria's hand moving almost independently of thought. Isabella's scream was primal and horrible. Marcus grabbed Victoria's wrist, trying to pull her back, but Victoria wrenched free and stabbed again, this time catching Isabella's shoulder. Blood bloomed across Isabella's shirt, shockingly red against the white fabric, and she crumpled to the floor making sounds no human should make. Marcus, his voice shaking, "Victoria, stop! What are you?" But she turned on him with the blade still in her hand, her expression transformed into something he didn't recognize. "This is your fault," she said, her voice eerily calm now. You brought her into our lives, you humiliated me, you destroyed everything we built. The next few seconds stretched into eternity. Marcus backing away, hands raised. Victoria advancing with the blade. Isabella on the floor bleeding and crying. And the accumulated rage of 15 years of compromised marriage finally finding expression in violence that had been simmering beneath suburban politeness for longer than any of them had acknowledged. Marcus tried to grab Victoria's wrist again, tried to wrestle the knife away. But she was beyond reason now, consumed by fury that had been building for 6 months of knowing about the affair and 15 years of unhappy marriage. They struggled near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Marina Bay, the city's lights glittering 43 stories below, completely indifferent to the violence occurring in its luxury towers. The knife caught Marcus in the chest, not deeply enough to kill instantly, but enough to make him stagger backward. His expression was shock more than pain, unable to process that his wife had just stabbed him, that the affair he'd thought was a private arrangement had escalated to this. He grabbed at the wound, blood seeping between his fingers, and looked at Victoria with something like betrayal, as though she had violated rules he hadn't realized applied to him. What happened next would later be subject to debate. Victoria claimed self-defense, claiming Marcus had attacked her, and she'd acted instinctively. The physical evidence suggested something more complicated, that Victoria, having already stabbed both her husband and his mistress, had reached a point of no return where the only options were continuing the violence or facing murder charges. The rage that had sustained her through months of planning had transformed into something colder and more final. The understanding that she'd crossed a line, and that the only way forward was to eliminate everyone who could testify about what had actually happened. She stabbed Marcus again, this time with more deliberation, the blade finding space between his ribs. He collapsed against the window, leaving a bloody smear on the glass as he slid down. His attempts to speak produced only gurgling sounds as blood filled his lungs. Victoria stood over him, her expression empty now, the rage burned out and replaced with the flat affect of someone who destroyed everything and had nothing left to feel. Isabella, still conscious despite her wounds, watched from the floor as Victoria turned back toward her. The next few minutes were Isabella's final moments. She begged, pleaded, promised to leave Singapore immediately and never speak of the affair, offered anything that might convince Victoria to spare her. But Victoria was beyond negotiation. The videos that had been her weapon for psychological torture were now evidence of premeditation, proof that this violence hadn't been spontaneous but the culmination of months of planning. Victoria stabbed Isabella 3 more times, methodically, watching the life drain from the woman who'd slept with her husband. There was no passion in it anymore, just the mechanical completion of an act already begun. When Isabella finally stopped moving, Victoria dropped the knife and looked around the penthouse that was now a crime scene. The marble floors were streaked with blood. Marcus was dead or dying near the windows. Isabella was clearly gone, and Victoria stood amid the carnage she'd created, realizing that her plan for humiliation had become a double murder that would either send her to prison for life or require an exit strategy she hadn't prepared. She chose exit. Victoria walked to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of wine with hands that had stopped shaking, and returned to the living room. She sat on the white leather sofa that was now spattered with blood and drank slowly, looking at the 2 bodies that had once been her husband and his mistress. Then she typed a message on her phone, not to police, but to her lawyer, a man who'd handled sensitive matters for her family before. I need immediate assistance at my Marina Bay property. Bring the cleanup team. This will be expensive. The message was sent at 2:47 a.m. by 4:00 a.m., when police finally arrived in response to noise complaints from neighbors who'd heard screaming. The scene had been partially staged to suggest a different narrative than what had actually occurred. But blood evidence is difficult to manipulate. Security footage from the building's elevators told a story Victoria couldn't control, and witnesses had seen her forcing Marcus and Isabella into her car hours earlier. The murder scene at Marina Bay was discovered by Singapore police in the early morning hours of October 21, 2022. The responding officers found Marcus Ashford dead from multiple stab wounds, Isabella Garcia dead from similar injuries, and Victoria Ashford sitting calmly on her blood-spattered sofa, still holding a wine glass, seemingly in shock but conscious and aware. The investigation moved with the speed and efficiency Singapore's police force was known for. Security footage from the Shangri-La Hotel showed the initial confrontation. Victoria's car GPS and building security captured her forcing Marcus and Isabella to her penthouse. Elevator cameras showed all three entering, but only Victoria ever leaving. The forensic evidence, blood patterns, weapon positioning, injury locations, told a story of assault rather than self-defense, of premeditated violence rather than spontaneous passion. Victoria's initial statement claimed that Isabella had attacked her, that Marcus had tried to intervene, and that the deaths were tragic results of self-defense during a confrontation about the affair. But the physical evidence contradicted this narrative at every point. The wounds on Isabella and Marcus were consistent with an attacker standing over victims, not defensive injuries. The knife was Victoria's, brought from her purse rather than grabbed from the kitchen in panic. And most damning, the timeline showed Victoria had held them captive for hours before the violence began, suggesting premeditation rather than heat of passion. The case became international news immediately. Singapore socialite kills husband and Filipino mistress in Marina Bay penthouse was the headline across Asian media. The story had everything: wealth, infidelity, violence, the dramatic setting, and the uncomfortable class and racial dynamics of a wealthy Chinese Singaporean woman killing a Filipino foreign worker who'd had an affair with her British expat husband. For Singapore's Filipino community, Isabella's death was devastating and infuriating. Here was another Filipino worker destroyed by the system that simultaneously needed and devalued them, killed by someone whose wealth had made her feel entitled to violence, and reduced to mistress, in headlines that barely acknowledged she'd been a skilled healthcare professional with a family and a life beyond her relationship with Marcus. Vigils were held outside the Philippine embassy, protests demanding justice, and calls for better protection of Filipino workers in Singapore. The trial began in March 2023 and lasted 4 months. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Victoria had discovered the affair, had collected evidence for months, had confronted and abducted Isabella and Marcus, and had murdered both of them in her penthouse in a premeditated rage killing. The surveillance videos Victoria had planned to use for humiliation became evidence of her obsessive documentation of the affair, supporting the premeditation charge. Victoria's defense team, an array of expensive lawyers from Singapore's top firms, pursued a sophisticated strategy. They argued that Victoria had been provoked by discovering her husband's affair, that the confrontation had escalated unexpectedly, and that she'd acted in the heat of passion rather than with premeditation. They portrayed Isabella as a gold digger who deliberately targeted a married man for financial gain, and Marcus as a manipulator who'd betrayed his wife and driven her to breaking point. They emphasized Victoria's previously clean record, her charity work, her role as a mother, and her family's prominence in Singapore society. The strategy was both legally questionable and morally repugnant. It amounted to victim-blaming both Isabella and Marcus while asking the jury to sympathize with Victoria's rage as a reasonable response to betrayal. But expensive lawyers often deploy moral bankruptcy when defending the indefensible, and Victoria's team was very expensive indeed. The testimony phase was brutal. Victoria took the stand, describing in clinical detail the pain of discovering her husband's affair, the humiliation of knowing he preferred a Filipino nurse to his wife, and the rage that had consumed her that night. She cried appropriately, expressed remorse, and insisted she'd never intended to kill anyone, that the violence had escalated beyond her control in a moment of overwhelming emotion. The prosecution countered with the surveillance videos, not just from the hotel but from Victoria's own home security system, showing her calmly preparing to leave that evening, checking that her knife was in her purse, and demonstrating none of the spontaneous passion her defense claimed. Expert witnesses testified about the stab wounds, positioning indicating victims who'd been held down or immobilized rather than active threats. And most devastatingly, the prosecution played audio from Isabella's final phone call attempts. She'd managed to dial emergency services before dying, and the recording captured her begging for her life while Victoria stood over her. The verdict, delivered in July 2023, found Victoria guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The premeditation evidence was too strong, the violence too sustained, and the victims too clearly defenseless for any self-defense claim to survive scrutiny. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with minimum 25 years before parole eligibility, one of the harshest sentences in Singapore's recent history for a murder by a woman, reflecting both the brutality of the crime and the public pressure to demonstrate that wealth couldn't purchase immunity from consequences. The civil consequences were equally severe. Marcus's family sued Victoria's estate for wrongful death, settling for undisclosed but reportedly substantial amounts. Isabella's family filed a civil suit seeking compensation for her death, ultimately receiving $2 million from Victoria's assets, money that provided financial security but couldn't replace the daughter, sister, and aunt they'd lost. For Isabella's family in Bulacan, the tragedy was compounded by shame and guilt. The Catholic community that had celebrated Isabella's success now whispered about the affair, about how she died, about whether she'd brought it upon herself through immoral behavior. Her mother, Rosario, never recovered from the loss, her health deteriorating rapidly under the weight of grief. Her father, Eduardo, became obsessed with the case, attending the trial via video link, trying to understand how his daughter's pursuit of a better life had ended with her bleeding to death on a Millionaire's floor. The younger siblings Isabella had been supporting struggled to continue their education without her remittances. The house in Bulacan, purchased with Isabella's years of nursing income, became a shrine to her memory rather than the family home she'd worked so hard to provide. The $2 million settlement, while substantial, came with the understanding that no amount of money could compensate for Isabella's absence or restore the future she'd been building through her sacrifice. For Marcus's children, Olivia and Sebastian, the trauma was multifaceted and devastating. They lost their father to violence, learned their mother was a murderer, and discovered that the family life they'd believed was normal had been a facade concealing dysfunction and rage. Both required extensive therapy. Both changed their surnames to their maternal grandfathers to distance themselves from the scandal. And both would carry for life the knowledge that their parents' inability to address marital problems honestly had resulted in murder. The Shangri-La Hotel, where the affair had been conducted, instituted new security protocols and privacy policies in response to the case. The surveillance footage that had documented the affair became evidence of security breaches. Staff had been bribed to access camera systems. Hotel security had been compromised for Victoria's evidence gathering, and the entire incident suggested that discretion and actual privacy were very different things. Room 2347, where Marcus and Isabella had met so many times, was reportedly renovated and renumbered to escape the association with the case. Singapore General Hospital conducted an internal investigation into whether Isabella had violated any professional conduct policies through her affair with a married man. They concluded she hadn't. Her relationship had occurred entirely outside work hours, hadn't affected her patient care, and hadn't involved any hospital resources or relationships. But the investigation itself was humiliating posthumously, reducing Isabella's 8 years of dedicated nursing service to a scandal about her private life. The broader questions raised by the case remained uncomfortable and largely unresolved. How much should foreign workers fear that relationship choices, even morally questionable ones, might cost them their lives when they involve citizens or wealthy residents? What accountability exists for people who use surveillance and wealth as weapons of psychological torture before physical violence? How do we recognize that Victoria was both a victim of betrayal and a murderer, without allowing the former to excuse the latter? The surveillance videos that started everything remained in evidence storage, a digital record of an affair that felt significant to the participants, but which the world reduced to cautionary tale about fidelity and rage. The 43 seconds of footage showing Isabella and Marcus arriving at the hotel, laughing and touching, alive and unaware that they were documenting their own path to death. Those seconds played repeatedly during the trial, analyzed frame by frame, until the humanity was extracted and only the evidence remained. Isabella Marie Garcia came to Singapore with the same dream that motivates millions of healthcare workers globally. That professional skill could overcome economic disadvantage. That sacrifice would be rewarded. That hard work in a wealthy country could provide for family in a poor one. She succeeded at everything she'd set out to achieve, becoming a skilled nurse, earning enough to support her family, lifting them from poverty that had seemed inescapable. And then she made the mistake of believing that a wealthy married man's attention meant she mattered as a person rather than as a convenience. She allowed loneliness to overcome judgment, financial pressure to justify moral compromise, and hope to blind her to the danger she was courting. She documented nothing on social media, told no one who might judge her, and conducted the affair with discretion that would have protected her if Victoria hadn't possessed the resources to purchase surveillance that demolished privacy. Marcus Ashford came to that affair seeking validation and escape, never fully acknowledging that his choices had consequences beyond his own pleasure. He used his wealth and position to pursue someone who had neither, who couldn't refuse his attention without risking the financial support she'd come to depend on, and who had no power to protect herself when his wife decided to punish them both. He died because he underestimated how much Victoria's rage would override the social conventions that normally protected men like him from consequences. Victoria Lim Ashford came to murder through months of accumulated rage, humiliation, and the toxic belief that her wealth entitled her to violent revenge against people who'd wronged her. She had legitimate grievances: betrayal, disrespect, the pain of discovering her husband preferred someone else. But she transformed that pain into systematic cruelty, followed by murder, demonstrating that sometimes the most dangerous people are those with resources to sustain their rage and execute their revenge without immediate consequences. 3 lives destroyed, 2 ended in blood on marble floors, 1 continuing in a prison cell where wealth means better accommodations, but no escape from the reality of what she did. And beyond them, the collateral damage: children without parents, families without loved ones, communities traumatized by violence that reminded foreign workers how vulnerable they remain in countries that need their labor but don't value their lives. The security footage that documented the affair remains as evidence and warning. The surveillance cameras that captured Isabella and Marcus's arrivals and departures, that showed their apparent happiness in stolen moments, that provided Victoria with the ammunition for psychological torture. Those cameras saw everything except what mattered most: the human complexity beneath the transaction, the loneliness that made bad decisions feel necessary, and the rage that transformed from emotional wound into physical violence. May Isabella rest in peace. May Marcus find whatever redemption exists beyond death. May Victoria spend her imprisonment understanding that revenge didn't heal her pain, only multiplied it across more lives. May Isabella's family find peace despite never understanding why their daughter's pursuit of a better life ended with her bleeding to death in a stranger's penthouse. And may we build a world where foreign workers aren't so vulnerable that affair with the wrong person can cost them their lives. The hotel hallway screaming that started this story, Isabella's voice when she realized her life was about to be destroyed by videos she'd never known existed, echoes still in the memories of everyone who witnessed it. It was the sound of someone watching their entire existence detonate, of recognizing that discretion and caution hadn't been enough protection, of understanding too late that some people's rage is patient and methodical and absolutely fatal. Her last words, captured on the emergency services recording before she died, were simple: "Please help me. I didn't mean for any of this. I just wanted to matter to someone. Please help." Help came too late. Justice came eventually. But Isabella was already gone, reduced to evidence and headlines, her 8 years of dedicated nursing service forgotten while the affair that killed her became her defining legacy. That's perhaps the cruelest tragedy, that she'll be remembered for how she died rather than how she lived, for the relationship that destroyed her rather than the healing work that defined her, for being a mistress who was murdered rather than a nurse who tried to save lives.